Hi everyone, welcome back. Been a couple weeks, feeling better, ready to record my next video, and this is something I'm very excited for. The deck tech for this is going to be slightly longer, just with a short history lesson and a bit of theory behind it. If that's not your thing, feel free to jump ahead to the gameplay. So, back in 2020, I had what I would say was my first brew that I was really proud of, really successful with. It was powerful enough that it did actually have an impact on the legacy metagame, which is always a badge of honor as a deck builder. Uh, the community affectionately dubbed it Pokepile. A quick summary of what this deck was doing is that it was a rug mid-range deck that was using Stifle in a new way, a way not really seen before. So previously, Stifle had always been viewed as kind of an aggressive card. You know, you stifle the fetch land that your opponent plays, and then you attack with Delver and Tarmogoyf, and you kill them quickly. You try to kill them quickly before they get on their feet. However, WOTC had recently printed some powerful new threats on Dreadhorde Arcanist and Oko, and these threats were kind of termed by the community to be snowbally threats, which means that the longer they sit in play, the more value they get. You know, so every time DHA can attack, you get an extra card. Every time Oko can plus, getting a food or a 3/3. So they were powerful, and the longer they stayed in play, the more powerful they got. So the idea was, you know, instead of playing Stifle in an aggressive strategy, what if we played it in a mid-range strategy? We use Stifle as a way to kind of get these cards down, you know, quote unquote, ahead of schedule, almost like a ramp spell that couldn't be removed. You know, so the idea is like, if you stifle a fetch land on turn 1 and then play Dreadhorde Arcanist on turn 2, it's almost like you're playing Dreadhorde Arcanist on turn 1 and getting it down that extra turn earlier, because it's a snowballing threat, means that you're getting even more value from it, and it means that the opponent is less likely to be able to deal with it, less likely to be able to answer it, remove it, or enact their game plan. But as you can see from all these yellow lines, these cards were eventually banned, and so for a long time there wasn't really a way to play this archetype. You know, there was nothing snowbally worth getting down ahead of schedule in a blue deck. So this archetype has kind of been sitting quietly, waiting for new cards to fit the shell. Which brings us to Modern Horizons 3. And Wizards of the Coast has graciously given us a gift, a very powerful gift, two very powerful gifts, in fact, the form of Psychic Frog and Tamiyo. So the deck we're going to explore today is what I've lovingly dubbed Esper Pokepile. There are a lot of things that MH3 has brought us legacy players to brew with, and I've been playing some of those on the channel, but this is the one that definitely fits my personal brand the best, and it's something I immediately kind of jumped on and was very excited about. So, you know, Psychic Frog, I think if you're playing Legacy, you know what this card does at this point. Very similar to Dreadhorde Arcanist in the sense that when it attacks, you are getting advantage. There's some positives and negatives where this one has to deal combat damage, whereas Arcanist just had to attack. But of course, this one can grow big and actually be a threat by itself. So, you know, there's trade-offs. It's also blue, which is pretty nice. You don't want to be pitching it because it's good, but it is nice. If you see the deck, the blue count is astronomical here. So your forces are pretty much always turned on. And then Tamiyo is very similar, where you are gaining value when you attack. You get the clue token. Obviously, it's a little bit more mana intensive, but this card is only 1 mana, and the flip side is also getting you value either by returning your instants of sorceries or threatening to ultimate. I think that as good Magic players, we've kind of been trained to ignore the Planeswalker ultimate, but when your Planeswalker costs 1 mana and has a +2, it's actually a lot more reasonable than you might expect. So, it does come up in one of the games that we'll be watching. So this was my first draft with Esper. I think that, you know, you kind of have the base shell of, you know, Frog, Tamiyo, Stifle, and then like the blue good cards. And then where you want to go with that, there's a little bit of experimenting that I'm going to have to do, and we as a community are going to have to do, where you could stay in green. You know, the original deck had green in it for Uro, You could dip into red for, you know, Power Blast, Lightning Bolt, stuff like that. You could stay straight blue-black. You know, blue-black is very powerful right now, has a lot of good tools. And so there's a lot of ways to do it, but my thought process was I wanted the white splash for the powerful removal, the best removal in the format, because these threats are very good at taking over the game if you aren't losing to what your opponent is doing. And so I never wanted to have a situation where my removal didn't line up to what my opponent was playing. You know, where if my opponent reanimates a Troll of Khazad-dûm and I'm not playing white and I have Fatal Push instead of Swords to Plowshares, then I'm in trouble. You know, things could go wrong at that point. I could lose before getting ready to leverage you know, the card advantage that these plays make. Similarly in green, you know, you do get Uro, but you're stuck with the black removal. And one of the one of the allures of playing Teamer back in the day was that Oko turning your opponent's things into 3/3s and then using Lightning Bolt to kill them was very powerful. And Oko kind of was your white removal, quote unquote, if that makes any sense, where it was just very powerful and generic and didn't care kind of like about the size or the CMC of the creatures your opponent was playing. So without that, I think that white is the way to go. At least it's certainly the way that I wanted to go. Additionally, you know, we've missed the loss of Astrolabe dearly, so I've added a couple more mana sources into the deck. I think the original list was playing 20. Here I have 21 plus the Lórien, and then of course the Undercity Sewers is some nice selection. One quick note, this was my first draft, and in my haste, I just simply forgot to switch out the Misties for Flooded Strands, so just a strictly worse thing. So this was my first try on Esper, and I actually ended up trophying, which I was very, you know, pleasantly surprised by. So we're going to walk through the VOD today and kind of break down my plays, break down the synergies and the power of what this deck is doing, and see kind of how you can use Stifle to leverage stuff like this. I have one Nihil Spellbomb main as a nod to Scam. Quick disclaimer, a lot of my brewing is with the idea that something is going to be hit from that deck eventually. You know, if you have a big tournament that you care about, you can play Scam. Still what I would recommend. It's an unfortunate state of Legacy because there's so many cool things to brew and test with, but just likely none of them are going to be more powerful than Blue-Black Scam, which is what it is. I'm still having fun trying out new things, and I'm hoping that we get a good look at what this deck can do. So let's jump into the games. All right, so round one, we were against Hello Newton. He tends to play the Fatal Control deck very often, and I think that on paper this is a good matchup for this deck, just because they don't have that much removal for our snowbally threats, and we have a lot of removal to break up their synergies. So here I just fetch up a Tundra, play out the Tamiyo, I get a Noble. Now I have two options. I can either plow that or play the Frog. Obviously first attack. And here I decide to play out the Frog. It's just a little bit more mana efficient. Again, you know, we want to be snowballing early and, you know, getting as much advantage with this stuff as we can. And then, you know, because we have the Swords to Plowshares and it is a flexible removal spell, if my opponent, you know, follows up with something big and scary, we have answers to that too. So that was kind of my process here. My opponent has the follow-up with the Cradle. Is again for 2, and then get a Knight or a White. This is one of the new cards from Modern Horizons 3. It's kind of like a mix between Knight of the Reliquary and the Fiend Artisan. So people are trying it out in a deck like this. It's kind of the perfect spot for it. So here, of course, I want to Swords that, and not let it untap and do important things, and no need to give my Frog flying. If they want to chump with the Noble, it's very good for me. Drawing a land here is quite nice. Ponder into a Force of Will and flip the Tamiyo. Of course, here I have another Swords of Plowshares, which I decide to use. I think that You know, of course, you could say that you could save the swords for a bigger threat, but I think getting rid of 2 mana, you know, 1 from the Noble, 1 from the Gaia's Cradle, is worth it. Plus, I have this Force of Will as well. So again, I just want to kind of blunt what they're doing. Drawing the Prismatic Ending is quite good. And then the thought process was that, you know, forcing the Green Sun makes it easier for my Frog to attack, and I like that. And then before I drew the ending, I thought Tamiyo would tick down and get a swords, but after drawing the removal spell, start ticking up and working towards ultimate. And here I actually leave some instants and sorceries for my Tamiyo to get. Opponent plays an Ufe, which is a little annoying because it stops both my clue tokens from being cracked. However, you know, Tamiyo is here to save the day. Also, one quick synergy that I may or may not have learned when this happened on Magic Online is that minusing Tamiyo does in fact grow the Murktide because it's an instant sorcerer leaving your graveyard. And because I want to crack the clues and again keep the Cradle mana to a minimum, I just decide to move everything, draw the Stifle, and then here I just draw Cantrip. And I think I'm pushing for lethal this turn, I believe. So I'm just growing the Murktide by giving the Frog flying. This is a very powerful synergy. Yeah, that's game 1. So game 2, of course, my opponent is on the play. This hand is pretty solid, just pile of removal and some cantrips. You know, again, if you can hurt their Cradle mana, break up their synergies, this is where you want to be against a deck like Cradle Control. As Once Upon a Time, they find an Ignoble Hierarch off of that and play it. And here I actually decided to Brainstorm just because I felt like I wanted to see all my options before I used a certain removal spell. You know, I do play other removal in my deck, and Swords is a premium spell. And as you see, we did draw the Orcish, which is a really good way to kill the Noble while getting on board. Opponent plays a Fiend Artisan and then passes the turn. I could use Swords or I could use Edict. Felt like Edict was a little bit more mana efficient here. And also kind of a bait in a sense where it's like I do the Edict before I play my land, and so if my opponent wants to fetch for a Dryad Arbor and sacrifice that, I'm actually very happy to use this as an effective sinkhole, which is what happens. So here they just have a Zenith. Because they missed the regular land drop, I felt like killing the Dryad Arbor was a very strong play, and then of course getting the Murktide down is also quite powerful. It's a very quick clock. Opponent misses a land again. This was obviously the draw for turn because I would have just played it last turn. Pondered into a Force of Will, and again just want to put pressure on. This is a 2-turn clock here, so I just want to force anything. Opponent plays a new land. This is a new land from the Commander portion of MH3. It says when it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature phases out. And this is really useful with cards that can find this land at instant speed. So like the White of the Reliquary or Elvish Reclaimer. It's not as powerful here where you're just playing it at sorcery speed, unfortunately for my opponent. And then the only play here is to play Endurance as a chump blocker, you know, very desperation play, but of course I do have the Force of Will, and then this is lethal. So those are the games. That was round 1. So round 2, my opponent is Mana Station. They tend to be known for playing some big mana decks. Luckily we're on the play. Unfortunately, our hand was just a 1-lander with Scrubland as our only land, so that's not acceptable. This is a much better 6. We do not currently have the way to cast the Psychic Frog, but other than that, I'm feeling pretty good. Bottom of the Murktide is just a little bit far off. Everything else is probably better. So here I lead on Underground Sea. Opponent plays Once Upon a Time for Urza's Tower. Plays the tower. The tower is not used to not be a particularly common card to see in Cloud Post. However, there is a new land from Modern Horizons 3 that does power it up. We will certainly see that as this game goes on. When it has another tower, I decided to brainstorm an end step because I just really want to find a land to play out the Psychic Frog and start getting things going. And I do also find a Daze to go along with that, which makes me feel in quite good shape. Plays out a Boseiju frog, or attack with a frog, and I decided that I want to turbo out a Murktide Regent this turn because my opponent is not having the fastest start, and I think that cards like Bowmaster and Swords are not the strongest against the current iterations of Cloud Post, so I just want to, you know, block my opponent as fast as possible. So I play out the Murktide. So here my opponent plays a Once Upon a Time. I decided to Daze it. You know, my opponent has not been playing the... I think playing Boseiju is a sign that they're land light, and so this is probably looking for more mana sources. So I want to Daze this, and also kind of nice here that they're tapped out, so they can't crop rotation. However, my opponent does have the Elvish Spirit Guide to pay for the Daze, so that was always going to trade in that way. And they do find a Wasteland, and here, while they can't crop rotate, unless of course they had another Spirit Guide, I decide to hit the tower. So this is the new card, Planar Nexus. So it's every card type, or every non-basic land type, which includes Urza's Tower, Urza's Mine, and Urza's Power Plant. So when this is in play, tower can tap for 3 mana. That's why I decided to hit the tower rather than the Boseiju. Even though it is their only source of green mana, green is more like a splashy thing in their deck. So unfortunately here, they have the third tower, which lets them play out a 1 ring. However, Stifle showing you the myriad of uses that it has. I can stifle the protection here, and I do have lethal play. In game 2, we do have one of our sideboard Damping Spheres. Very useful in this matchup. This is a card where it's like, in the matchups it's good, it's incredibly good, and so it's one of the few cards that I play as a 2 of in my sideboard, just because I want to see it I really want to see it in the matchups I'm bringing it in for, like this one. So here opponent has a Cloud Post. I draw a Tamiyo, which is an incredible draw. Just putting the pressure on very quickly, quote-unquote pressure. Opponent has a Planar Nexus, which does count as a Locus, so Cloud Post does now tap for 2. They play a Vexing Bauble out, which obviously I can't really do much about. And they play a Disruptor Flute as well, which I can no longer Daze due to the Bauble. And the name here is Wasteland, which is a powerful name. I think it makes sense. And here, we saw in the previous round against Cradle Control, where I had the choice between being interactive or playing on a frog. I chose the frog, but I think in this case, just stopping their mana development is really, really important. I think it's worth wasting one, quote-unquote, one card to get around that. So here opponent has a second Disruptor Flute. They name Psychic Frog, which is a great name. It is one of the cards that they would be scared about, essentially. So here I decide to hold off. I can play the Bowmaster out now, or I could decide to crack a clue, see what I want to do. Also, there is an interesting interplay between Damping Sphere and Instance. So here I just decide to Island Cycle, because I have these clue tokens that I want to be cracking. I definitely don't mind getting more land here. Drawing the Brainstorm is good. I decide to do it and flip the Tamiyo. I'm kind of looking for more interaction, potentially ways to kill artifacts, or Brazen Borrower to bounce this one on Wasteland, and potentially Wasteland them, stuff like that. Or counter magic, or just getting rid of these frogs that I can't really cast, which is what I do here. Tamiyo does flip, and I can start plussing that. Cloudpost not known for great ways to pressure planeswalkers as well. So here my opponent taps for mana for a Mycospawn, and the interaction I was mentioning between instant speed spells and Damping Sphere will come up here. So I'm going to fetch a land and play out the Bowmaster against my opponent. And now, because I have this Damping Spirit in play, the Daze costs a mana, which means that the Vexing Bauble doesn't prevent it from working, which allows me to counter the spawn with the trigger on the stack. Because of that, they decide to get Tabernacle. This is a pretty good play. I don't have much to do this turn, so I do decide to paid for the Orc, and I let the rest die. And then I decided that drawing with the Clue token is potentially more valuable. Now Tamiyo is in, threatening ultimate, which is obviously quite powerful. Murktide is here as well. Opponent does get to channel the Seiju to destroy my Damping Sphere. Unfortunately, I don't have a Stifle for this. And even if I wanted to Brainstorm, I would not be able to find a Stifle. I could have considered playing out the second Damping Sphere. I think in retrospect that might have been a good play, rather than just holding up the Clue token. Though I will say, with only one card left in hand, it's going to have to be something really, really good in order to have an impact here. Here my opponent does have the tower. They have all the mana in the world. However, they don't have too much to do with it, it looks like. And I do get to ultimate the Tamiyo here, which draws me a metric buttload of cards. I decide to Petty Theft the Disruptor Flute that is stopping a Frog. My thought process here is that, Frog is going to be powerful. I have so many cards in hand. Unfortunately, I did this before doing math. I should have done math because even though I drew a lot of cards, I'm a few instants short of actually winning with the Murktide Regent, like discarding instants to the Frog and then giving Frog flying to grow the Murktide. I'm a tiny bit short of that, so I should have done the math first before making this play, because I think I could have done more disruptive plays rather than more aggressive plays where, okay, yes, this is a 2-turn clock, that's good and all, but I think I had better lines. So here, what I did, my opponent went for Crop Rotation. That was one of the last cards in hand. And I decided to Force of Will that and then just Stifle the Vexing Bauble trigger. That was countering the Force of Will. So again, Stifle showing its versatility and getting you out of potentially sticky situations. My opponent could have rotated for Ayabugan, and with the huge amount of mana, would have been able to get something big in play at the same turn. So in the end, their cards they had in hand weren't quite enough to get there, and we did take it home, but I do think that was slightly loose and that I should have considered taking a different line rather than playing out the Frog, where I think maybe I could have gone for this Wrath of the Skies to kill their artifacts, and then potentially played out a Damping Sphere of my own. Again, restrict their mana after using the Wrath. But yeah, 2-0. I will be back for the next round. Round 3 against Mats Ole. Mats tends to be another Golgari enjoyer, we'll say. So here they do play out the turn 1 Gaia's Cradle. After Once Upon a Time, again, just like before, I do think this is a pretty positive matchup, mainly because, we have removal for their synergies, and they don't have as much removal for our threats. So here they play out another Dryad Arbor, and then they bestow a Springheart and Tuco onto the Dryad Arbor, which I have a few potential lines. I decide that I want to just waste the Cradle and just play out the Frog. I think that getting the Frog going here is pretty good. I am giving my opponent potentially the ability to make more copies of Dryad Arbor with the Springheart and Tuco, but I kind of felt like that was not the scariest thing in the world, that it was worth it to get my Frog down. And as it turns out, my opponent didn't even have a land to play. So here I just attack with Frog. They wisely decide not to put anything into it. I draw my card, and then again I have some options. Some combination of Wasteland and Swords to Plowshares could be good here. And I decide to just get rid of their mana again. They missed a land drop, and the Springheart and Tuco is not particularly scary. Just, by itself, making the 1 insects doesn't do too much, even if they start drawing land. And then my opponent feels that I'm far enough ahead, given my board, and attacks it in. In game 2, I have a pretty reasonable hand. Have some interaction and a threat in the form of Tamiyo. I decided to force the turn 1 Reclaimer just because I don't have 2 mana yet, and I want to just kind of start snowballing with my Tamiyo. That's kind of my thought process there. I don't know if this deck plays Wasteland, and so might have been a little bit too timid in getting a Swamp instead of a Scrubland, just because I do have this Wrath Disguise that eventually I would like to cast. But I felt like not having a 3rd land and having like Clues to Crack and Ponders to cast and whatnot, that it was probably worth it to play it a little safe. But eventually that comes back to bite me. The opponent has a Green Sun Zenith here for X equals 2. And here I have an option where I can just Petty Theft the Reliquary, but I think I'm going to have 2 clues in play. I really want to start getting my land drops and being able to convert, these into actual cards, and that means I need to have my mana set up under me, and just bouncing the right, it's not even that great because it's just going to come down next turn and I'll have to deal with it. So I decided to Ponder. Fortunately, Ponder does not see another land, and the Shuffle doesn't either. And this is, I think, is where the game starts to slip away from me a little bit. So they have another Zenith and a land to play around the Daze. They get a second white, and they attack me for 4. So here, attack again. And I decide to play out the Murktide Regent as kind of... It stops... in theory, it stops the Reliquaries from attacking. Whereas Petty Theft doesn't necessarily do that, and they just replay it again. But this comes... How do I put this? My unfamiliarity with what the deck is capable of, I think, comes to bite me here, because it doesn't quite work out as well as I was hoping. So opponent fetches for Arbor and turns it into a fetch land. This is just to grow the Reliquaries to 5/5s, and then they fetch again on their turn and get a Dryad Arbor, and then they attack, and then before blocks, they can turn the Dryad Arbor into the Talon Gates, which phases out my Murktide. And this is exactly 12, so very well played by my opponent here to kill me very quickly and get around my blocker. You can see that some of the new MH3 cards added a power level boost to this archetype as well, which is very cool. Alright, on to game 3. In game 3, luckily have the play for this one. Pretty good opening hand. I decided to force this, kind of the same reason as before, where it's like, I just want my snowballing threat to take over the game and not have to worry about them building a big board very quickly. I decided to pitch the second Psychic Frog rather than the Brainstorm, just because I feel like this is more powerful. It does play a little bit into removal, like say my opponent has Dismember here. then this could potentially be bad for my frog. But luckily they don't have it, and I do get a Daze there, turn 2 play. So now the frog can start going off, drawing a card, get some removal, which is great, of course. Have another Green Suns, but you know, I do have the answer in the Prismatic Ending. And here I decided to ponder, and I decided to keep the Stifle just because the deck does have a lot of activated abilities, so I'm okay with that. Opponent plays out the fetch land and plays the Endurance. Opponent has not seen the Stifle out of my deck yet, so they choose not to fetch right away, which I think, from their point of view, it does kind of make sense, but obviously it plays well for me. I put back a Wrath of the Skies and a Force of Will with this Brainstorm. I don't think I need Force here. I have a lot of good interaction, and the Wrath at this point I don't really need because their board is small, and I also have a frog. Engineer better. So here I could have potentially let this go, but I feel like just stifling a fetch is pretty reasonable. This helps me play around something like a natural order where they can't do that yet, and they do eventually find Dismember. But at this point, I think the frog is drawing 4 cards, so it's like I'm very happy with this exchange. Opponent fetches for the Arbor and goes to bestow the Spring Heart on it. Unfortunately, this does play into Daze. Or I guess, fortunately for me, unfortunately for them. And then now the 1/1 here is a very good target for my Plague Engineer. And then, of course, the Tamiyo was an incredible draw. Just being 1 mana by itself is just so powerful. Again, they're stuck on a low land count. Don't have much in the way of creatures, so I'm not really worried about anything. And the Tamiyo will start taking over. And I think... So I am generally not a turbo flip Tamiyo kind of guy, where it's like, I could have potentially just not cracked the clue, and then on the following turn, cracked both clues to flip Tamiyo. But when nothing else is going on, I'm usually very, very fine, very content with just drawing 2 cards a turn to my opponent's 1. That's kind of the mindset you have to be in for the Pokepile strategy, is, you know, you're not trying to do huge, big, flashy things. You're just trying to do things a little bit ahead of schedule and just be fine to grind out the opponent. I do find the Brainstorm, which kind of changes the calculus a bit, where I want to use this and find more interaction, and then you know, the Tamiyo taking up and being able to get back a removal spell the next turn is powerful. So I felt like it was worth it there, and my opponent sees the writing on the wall. Just having the active Tamiyo against what their deck is trying to do is very powerful, so they decide to concede. And with that, we're 3-0, so let's go to the next round. It's round 4 on the draw, and opponent goes Underground Sea Pass, which does not bode well for me. Means it's likely Scam, you know, if I had to guess, and whether it is actually Scam. And my opening hand is not particularly good for being on the draw. It has a lot of cantrips, but not a lot of interaction, where if you're on the play, you can turn those cantrips into interaction before your opponent does too many things, but on the draw, it's a little bit tougher. So you see this Ponder is an incredible Ponder. We see our 1 of Nihil Spellbomb in the deck exactly for Scam. But as the game plays out, you'll see that being on the draw means that it's not going to help us enough. So here, opponent does have the turn 1 Entomb. It's the thing that allows this archetype to go way over the top of you know, what a general tempo deck might do. Just real quick, I put the Ponder in my hand rather than the Spellbomb to play around Grief, which I did have, but they also have the Reanimate, so all 3 cards that are on the potential table in terms of like the ban talks on Twitter do show up here. The Grief is the least relevant of them. Obviously the Entomb and the Reanimate are what make this tick, but if I did have a stronger hand with like Daze or Force of Will, Grief clearing the way would have also been quite powerful, of course. Is not super relevant. My opponent picks up, I believe it was Animate Dead, Psychic Frog, and Ponder, as well as a land. So this was what I'm working with, known info wise. But yeah, I'm in rough shape, unfortunately. The Atraxa is going to kill me very quickly, and I believe I just pack it in here just because I don't have a removal spell right away. The frog's going to come down, and yeah, it was too fast. It was too fast for a draw that could have potentially stopped it if I was on the play. So I pack it in. So in game 2, I think it gets a little better after board. I have a few more pieces of good graveyard hate, and I can trim on some potentially bad cards. I think I trimmed down to 2 Force of Wills to make room for more graveyard hate. Here I could have fetched an Underground Sea, but I want to play around Wasteland a bit, it being my only blue source in the hand. And usually I am pretty okay with using the Spellbomb for quote-unquote no value, where if I'm getting rid of my opponent's graveyard and countering the reanimate that's on the stack, I'm generally pretty happy with that exchange, even if it didn't also get to draw a card. So here my opponent plays a Grief. I could have considered forcing it and making it a 2 for 2, but with the Spellbomb in play, I think I'm just happy to take the 2 for 1 here. So they take the swords, could potentially mean they have a Psychic Frog draw of their own, and I draw a land, which is very ideal here. I get to play out my frog, and I do not have the Daze for that. Now they play their own frog, kind of as we suspected, and unfortunately, so they, I think, make a pretty big misplay here, where they choose to block. And I guess their thought process was we have the same number of cards in hand, so the frogs will just bounce off each other. But of course, I have the onboard trick of getting to cycle Nihil Spellbomb. So we slowly march down to both having no cards in hand. Even like discarding, like I think it would have been fine if you just wanted to let your frog die, trade 2 cards for 2 cards, and then bounce my frog so that it's a 1/2 again. Like, even that I think would have been more acceptable than what ended up happening here. So once we're all empty-handed and I don't have to worry about anything, I cycle the Spellbomb, making my frog a 6/7, and then prompting the concession just because opponent has no cards in hand, no graveyard, and I have an active Psychic Frog, which is very powerful. I don't know if my opponent has any like removal spells, in hand, like potentially, or in deck rather, like Fatal Push or stuff like that. But yeah, they felt they were very far behind, which I agree. Right, game 3. All right, so game 3, opponent probably would have been in better shape if we had just gone back and forth on Psychic Frogs for a bit. But as it stands, this is where we are, and opponent is on the play for game 3. This hand is not good against like a fast Entomb start, but does play a pretty good fair game. We have enough lands, we have 2 snowballing threats, and we have a Daze, so about everything I could hope for. And even though I'm land heavy, I do kind of just want to curve out Tamiyo into Frog and not get wastelanded, so I do fetch the basic island. Now opponent here passes with 2 mana up, and they're representing a couple things. Basically, they're representing Bowmasters and they're representing Entomb. And so, for these reasons, I decided to not play out the Psychic Frog. And that might be a mistake, but maybe I'm just kind of shell-shocked after getting Entombed in game 1, where I don't have another... If I play out the Frog, I'm playing into Daze, and I also don't have another blue card for the Force, so it's like my opponent could Entomb and then reanimate, and then, have a Daze for my Force of Will, or they animate dead, they could have Daze, like a lot of bad things could happen. And because I have ways to spend my mana this turn, it makes it much more appealing to pass. I don't have to worry as much about my opponent getting to spend their mana efficiently while I don't. And again, here, this is kind of an issue where it's like, this is the power of Entomb, right? Where to play around Bowmasters, it would be really, really nice to just crack my clue right now, you know. But if my opponent has Entomb plus Daze, then suddenly I feel really foolish for cracking the clue. So I do fetch, but I decide to let my opponent go to the turn. And again, still, even right now, because I don't have an answer to a troll, if my opponent like tries to reanimate it, I would want to force that. And again, I wouldn't want to play into Daze. So it's like I'm kind of forced to play into Bowmaster here, just because like the threat of getting Dazed is very powerful. And also part of my calculus is that I don't actually care about the Bowmaster that much, where it's like it can't kill anything on board, and it can't block the Tamiyo from attacking. So it's like yeah, it's kind of annoying that like this is the thing my opponent had rather than the Entomb or the Animate Dead, but even playing into it, the outcome is not that bad. And they do have the Fatal Push. I'm okay to let go. The Tamiyo did get a 2-for-1, and my thought process for the next turn was that I was just going to Swords this and then play out the Frog, or potentially play out the Frog in Wasteland. I wasn't sure yet, but I didn't want to set myself back a land. I decided to just lock in the 2-for-1. Very fine for that exchange to happen. And then drawing the Bowmasters is really good here. It lets me save the swords for the Troll if that comes into play. So here I decide to just play out the Bowmaster, kill their Bowmaster, and then use my Wasteland to make my Daze a little bit live. Obviously, now that I'm tapped out, it plays into a Daze my opponent might have, but I know that I have a Daze. I don't know if my opponent has a Daze, and so it kind of makes sense for me to make my Daze more likely to work at the cost of something else. My opponent plays their Bowmaster out. I feel like this is worth a force just because it would kill mine. Having mine in play is shutting off their cantrips. If theirs is in play, it shuts off my cantrips. It makes my Psychic Frog a good deal worse. And it means I'm taking more damage from the Orc army. Like, it would be a 3-3, and that's actually kind of a full card at that point. 2-2 is like half of a card, we'll say, and then like the 3-3 is like a full card at that point. So it felt fine, and then luckily they did not have the Daze here. Good for me. Yeah, I just play out my Frog. I'm fine to attack with the Orcish Bowmaster. Not the Orc army. I think I would chump block here if push came to shove. So I thought that being at 13, then being at 18, and I have the Snowball threat in play, it's worth it to just prevent the damage. Of course, I don't think my opponent would attack, given that there's a Frog in play, but still. Maybe they have an answer to the Frog, you know. Here they choose not to attack. And they're holding up all their mana, they don't make a play, so it's like, I could have chosen to give my Frog flying, and maybe in retrospect that would have been better. But instead I just decide to grow it and try to eat the army in combat. It doesn't work out so great for me because they do have the petty theft for it. But, you know, it's not the end of the world. You could view it as, like, I guess it is kind of, you could view it as, like, the Underground Sea is trading, quote-unquote, 1-for-1 with the Brazen Borrower, but they did get some tempo of, you know, they saved their guy, and then, you know, I had to spend my turn replaying my guy. So, slightly disadvantageous trade, but, it's not the end of the world. Opponent does have the Entomb in the end step, and they get the Archon, which is good, but the Bowmaster does check because it, you know, you can sacrifice the army to the Archon trigger. Opponent does Ponder. I decide to shoot the army token because I figured if they were to reanimate this, then the second Bowmaster ping could kill off the army token fully. Luckily for me, opponent doesn't do anything. So here I decide I like all my cards in hand quite a lot, so I am just going to give this flying and attack. Draw my extra card, which is a Polluted Delta. I decided to play it out. You know, I have a lot of instants in hand. My opponent does have a Wasteland, so I felt like it was worth it to just develop my mana rather than potentially have an extra card for the frog. Opponent plays a frog of their own, and then does not choose to attack. And here I have a choice where it's like, do I want to use my swords on their Psychic Frog, even though there's this Archon kind of looming in the graveyard? And I decided to Surveil first just because I could potentially stifle a Wasteland if I need to. And I kept the Ponder on top because, good. Ponder's a good card here. I want to find more removal, and Ponder helps me to do that, which finds a Prismatic Ending. Get to fetch a Tundra and hold up Stifle still, ending the frog, and then now I'm fine to attack with both my frogs. Once they block, I can just discard one of the Stifles to the frog. To me, that was worth more than exiling 6 cards from my graveyard to give them both flying. That was my calculus, just because that will dry up very quickly, and then they still have the 2/2 in play. And I can't cast both this turn anyway. But we're pulling ahead. Opponent did not have reanimation spell, and our board presence was just a little bit too strong. And I think we saw the power of the white removal spells here, just having more clean answers to what my opponent was doing. It's very nice. The Prismatic Ending was good, and also the Tamiyo was good. Just being a powerful turn 1 threat that gets you card advantage can be good in these blue mirrors. So yeah, and with that we are 4-0, going to the trophy round. All right, on to the trophy round. We win the die roll. This hand is pretty good. You know, removal, threats, counter magic, basically all you could want. One of the downsides here is of turn 1 ponders that I don't necessarily know what I want, but I can feel confident enough that I want another land drop that I feel good passing the ponder here. I do find the land. There's a Swords of Plowshares underneath it and a Wasteland underneath that, which is good because my opponent plays Tamiyo, so I'm very happy to have the removal for this. And they do force, and I do get to Daze back. So a very good exchange for me. The ponder. I find Force of Will and 2 other lands, which is not what I want here at all. So I do shuffle. Fortunately, I'm drawing another land. But you know, this stuff gets discarded to frog either way, so even drawing a few lands is not necessarily the worst. My opponent does have a Bowmaster in play. Another Tamiyo. And they choose to Brainstorm to immediately flip the Tamiyo. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Because now I can attack it with Psychic Frog, and Psychic Frog draws cards when you deal damage to Planeswalkers. So I feel like if I were my opponent, I might have wanted to try to get in and attack first, but it's close. But now I have a tough decision to make, because, you know, the +2 of Tamiyo does mean that my frog is attacking as an O2. So even if I give it flying, I'd have to discard 4 cards if I wanted to kill the Tamiyo. 4 cards is a lot, even if you're drawing a card. Very big commitment. And if the opponent ends up having an answer for my frog, it's kind of a disaster. Alternatively, I could discard 3 cards, attack Tamiyo for 3, put it to 1, and then next turn attack it. It +2s again, it goes to 3, attack it for 3 again, and I kill it. And so it lets me save a card, but it commits me to attacking Tamiyo 2 turns in a row, and if they have an answer for frog, yes, I kept a card in hand, but now they have an active Tamiyo. So it's kind of like I'm trying to figure out what's the worst case scenario, and like, is it better to have a card, or is it better to just kill the Tamiyo right now and not worry about things? I decided that they're kind of unlikely to have an answer to the frog, just kind of the way the game is played out. You know, they didn't daze it, they didn't remove it, they played a Bowmaster instead, you know. So I decide that I'm just going to go all in and kill the Tamiyo here. So I discard my whole hand, minus the Swords of Plowshares. My thought process being that once this connects, after they draw a trigger is on the stack, I'm just going to kill their Bowmaster, get my card, and just kind of hope that they don't have an answer to this frog, but also kind of feel like they aren't likely to, given what has transpired. So my opponent does reanimate the Tamiyo, and then they choose to attack with the Orc Army token. I don't think I agree with this play. Of course, I can give my frog flying, but 3 cards a turn is a big drain on the graveyard, and so I'm very relieved, actually, that I don't have to use 3 cards. I can just attack, because, okay, I get rid of 3 cards and I give my frog flying. They could still potentially chump with the Tamiyo if they wanted to. Like, I'm running out of cards quickly at that point. So here I draw Frog and Murktide Regent. Play out the Frog. My opponent has a Daze, and they think about hard casting it, but then think better of it, which is good for them. I did have the Daze in hand, and that would have been bad for them. But I gladly made that exchange. But still, my opponent has, 2 unknowns. They don't seem that good, and I have an active Frog. One of them is a Death Shadow. That is pretty good. But it is only a 3/3 right now. And again, they attack with the Orc Army. Again, I'm not sure if I agree with this. Here I just decide to attack and offer the trade, or offer the chump, I should say. They choose not to, which is reasonable if they want to have the 8/8 in play. I do draw the card off the frog trigger, and luckily for me, it is a blue source, letting me play the Murktide Regent. And now I have 2 flying threats in play. 2 lethal flying threats in play. So my opponent casts a Ponder, but doesn't find what they need, and I can just give my frog flying and discard 2 cards to make it a 7 power. Or I guess I don't even need to. It's 5 power. There are 5. I don't know why I'm discarding cards here. But anyway, so the 1/2 punch of Psychic Frog into a big Murktide was enough to get it done against what's looking like blue-black Death Shadow with some Tamiyos as well. And some reanimates, because it's a good card. I assume Grief is in here as well. Alright, so game 2. My opponent does mulligan to 5, which is tough. Puts me in a good spot. However, this hand is definitely good enough to keep, but I will need to draw white mana at some point. And we will see that the brain fart of putting Misty in my deck instead of Flooded Strand is certainly a liability this game. That being said, of course I want the Misty, so I decided to draw it. I think I could have chosen to draw the second Daze instead. Potentially play around Grief a little bit better. Even though I can't use both in a turn, it means that my opponent couldn't discard 1. This is a very interesting spot where my opponent is brainstorming here without playing their land drop, and based on the timing tells last turn when I cast my Ponder, I felt my opponent was likely to have a Daze. And you have 2 lines of thought here, where 1, you could Daze the Brainstorm, and because my opponent has mulligan to 5, if I'm just trading 1-for-1 a lot, my extra 2 cards will pull ahead and I will be in a good spot. That's one way to think about it. The other way is that, okay, my opponent's mulligan to 5. If I can also blank the Daze in their hand, it's like they mulligan to 4, and that's even better. but because the game is so early, you are giving up a lot of tempo to do that. Like you're losing out a lot each turn to play around Daze, and I felt like it was worth it to just Daze the Brainstorm here. Also, if they don't have it and they don't have another land, that plus Wasteland could potentially win the game on the spot. So the ceiling was very high, and I felt like just one for winning a bunch, even if they have the Daze, is also pretty fine. So I do decide to Daze, and they do have the Daze back. But again, I'm kind of okay with that. Now, there is a bit... This was very close to being the worst possible, where, I gave my opponent a land drop that they potentially wouldn't have had by dazing my Daze. Then if they had Grief plus Reanimate, they could take my removal spells, and I would actually be in very bad shape. But I am a lucky person. They did not have the Reanimate, and I do get to Wasteland them. They do have a second land to play, though. But I do have another Wasteland. I do get an upkeep to play around Stifle. And they have Wasteland. But of course, no colored mana from their end. They miss a land drop. So I decided to Surveil. Here, I don't mind them Wastelanding me. I have enough mana sources. And here I Brainstorm, and then I play out the Nihil Spellbomb, which is kind of gets rid of the last thing I was worried about, we could say, where, if they reanimated a Grief, that would be like a nice little 2-for-1 for them. They would take my best card and have a threat in play. I figured that was more important than playing out the Psychic Frog, which I could just play out next turn. Spellbomb is good against like their better draws, so I felt like that was worth it. So here I just play out the Frog, and I play out the Murktide. When it does draw a land, and they do get to Fatal Push the Frog, but the third Wasteland prompts the concession. They must not have a answer in hand to Murktide, and so even if they were to draw a land next turn, it would be too much. And yeah, that takes it down and ends the trophy run. I will hop back in for the quote-unquote end of set review, but also talk about some changes I made to the sideboard after this league. Hi everyone, welcome back to the end of set review. We had a pretty good run here, so of course there's always ways that you can improve. So just wanted to talk about a few changes I made after thinking about the list a little bit more. So of course we add the Flooded Strands here. The Misty Rainforest is just worse. Quick oversight on my part. And then in the sideboard, even though we did not face Eldrazi aggro in the league, it's a deck that's been on my mind and on my radar. So I wanted to have a little bit more game against it. So I cut one Wrath of the Skies from the sideboard. I think that it's a new card. It's been seeing play in Modern, and I want to play with the new cards, but being double white and not having extra energy enablers means that it's not quite as good here as it is in Modern. It's kind of a more targeted hate piece for like Urza Saga decks in particular, and not just like a generically good card that you want to play a ton of copies of. And then I'm down one Hydroblast because I think that the red prison decks have kind of taken a backseat to these Eldrazi decks. So I'm adding one Consign to Memory. This is a good way to counter any Eldrazi spell, as well as its cast trigger. And if you have extra mana floating around, you can even play around Palace of the Void with the Replicate. And I also want to try one Harbinger of the Seas, kind of like the new Magus of the Moon, but for blue decks. I'm a little bit hesitant on this one. I think the blue, this was a very smart decision by Wizards, where you can't just fetch one of each basic and jam this on turn 3. So at best, you're only going to have one of your 2 off colors to play this card. But if you are completely shutting out what your opponent's capable of doing, that might be worth it. I think this is a little bit better than a card like Back to Basics, because your opponent still gets to have like 1 or 2 more big plays with Back to Basics down, And then additionally, now they're even playing some ways to deal with the enchantment. There's a couple of Eldrazi that have cast triggers that can deal with back to basics, whereas making your opponent not even able to produce colorless mana means that they can't even cast those effects with this one in play. So it's a card I want to try, see how it feels. We saw Damping Sphere do very well against the Go Bigger Cloud Post decks, but I don't think it's quite as good against the Eldrazi aggro builds, so just want a little more hate there. Anyway, again, hope you all enjoyed these games. This is an archetype that I'm very excited about. It's very much in my lane, and it's something I'm going to be experimenting with and tuning a little bit more. And then, kind of see where we end up and see if this is something that could kind of be a presence in the metagame once something is hit out of the scam deck, which I do anticipate at the very latest in August, but potentially sooner. Fingers crossed. We'll see what happens. So yeah, that was it. Hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you again soon. Bye, guys.